Racist cop sets up black woman, not knowing she's his new police captain. The night was heavy with rain, casting long shadows across the deserted highway. Headlights sliced through the darkness as the sleek black Mercedes crept down the road. The rhythmic swish of windshield wipers matched the faint hum of tires on wet asphalt. Behind the wheel sat Maya Johnson, her manicured hands gripping the steering wheel with quiet confidence. Her almond-brown eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, where flashing blue and red lights closed in fast. The patrol car trailed her for half a mile before the siren finally blared. Maya's heart stayed steady. She pulled over without hesitation, her movements measured. This wasn't the first time she'd been stopped. Being black in America meant knowing the drill. What the officer behind her didn't know was that tonight would be different. Before I go on, I know you are enjoying the story, so I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, smash the subscribe button down below, and turn on the bell notification to get notified whenever I drop a new video. Alright, let's continue. Officer Ray Carter stepped out of his patrol car, boots splashing into puddles. His face was carved with years of entitlement, a permanent sneer tugging at his thin lips. He adjusted his belt, where his gun rested snugly beside a bundle of plastic baggies tucked deep in his pocket. His partner stayed in the car, silent, watching, just like always. Carter approached the driver's side window, his flashlight beaming into Maya's face. She blinked but didn't flinch. He let the silence drag out, waiting for her to squirm. When she didn't, his grin tightened. License and registration. Maya moved slowly, her fingers brushing against the leather wallet in her handbag. She handed over the documents without a word. Carter's eyes flicked over her ID, then back to her face. Out of the car. It was always the same. No explanation. No reason. Just a routine humiliation wrapped in the language of authority. Maya's pulse remained steady as she stepped into the rain, her tailored black suit soaking against her skin. Carter's eyes flicked up and down, searching for cracks, something to justify what he was about to do. Hands on the car. Maya complied, palms pressing against the cold metal. The rain slicked down her braids, but she remained still, her breath measured. Carter leaned in close, his breath sour against her ear. Fancy car for someone like you. Maya said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was its own kind of weapon. Carter's hands patted down her pockets, lingering just long enough to remind her who held the power. Then he moved to the glove compartment, flicking it open without asking. His fingers dipped inside, quick and practiced. When he pulled out a small plastic bag of white powder, his grin widened. Well, well, he muttered, holding it up to the light. Looks like we got ourselves a little problem. Maya's eyes locked on the bag, then on him. The look she gave him was ice cold, sharp enough to cut through the storm. For a flicker of a second, Carter's grin faltered. But he buried it beneath the armor of his badge. Turn around. The cuffs clicked shut around her wrists. The metal bit into her skin, but Maya's face remained unreadable. The rain poured harder, soaking her clothes, washing away any trace of fear. Carter shoved her into the back of the patrol car, slamming the door behind her. He glanced at his partner through the windshield, sharing a knowing smirk. Another night, another easy setup. No one would believe a black woman over a decorated officer. As the patrol car pulled away, Maya leaned back against the cracked leather seat. The city lights blurred behind the streaked glass. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying the storm inside her chest. They thought they had her. They had no idea who they were playing with. The night swallowed the car as it disappeared down the highway, leaving behind nothing but rain and silence. Officer Ray Carter strode into the precinct with the kind of swagger that came from years of getting away with everything. His boots thudded against the worn linoleum floor, leaving streaks of rainwater in his wake. The station smelled of stale coffee and sweat, the low hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence between bursts of radio chatter. He dropped his clipboard onto the front desk, not bothering to glance at Maya as two officers processed her in the corner. Her hands were still cuffed behind her back, her wet clothes clinging to her frame. Dark braids hung over her shoulders, dripping onto the cracked tiles. Despite the humiliation, her face remained composed, stone-cold, unreadable. It gnawed at Carter. He was used to fear, to pleading. But she gave him nothing. Another one for the books, he muttered to the desk sergeant, loud enough for her to hear. The sergeant barely looked up from his paperwork. Carter's reputation stretched across the whole department. A man who got results, no matter how messy the method. The kind of cop you didn't question unless you wanted trouble. Caught her with possession, Carter added, tapping the plastic bag of white powder on the counter. His voice carried the smug confidence of someone who had played this game too many times. Maya's eyes flicked toward the bag, then back to Carter. Still, she said nothing. The silence was starting to get under his skin. The booking officer snapped her mugshot. One flash, two flashes. Maya stared straight into the lens, unblinking. It was a look Carter recognized, though he couldn't place where he'd seen it before. He leaned in close as they fingerprinted her, his breath hot against her cheek. "You can try to play tough all you want," he muttered. "But nobody walks away clean." Maya's lips barely moved. "Neither do you." For the briefest second, Carter froze. His smirk faltered, but only just. He leaned back, chuckling under his breath as if her words meant nothing. But something about the way she said it stuck to him, like a splinter buried too deep to pull out. By the time she was led to the holding cell, Carter was already bragging in the break room. Rich girl, thought she could buy her way out. He stretched out in a plastic chair, coffee steaming in his hand. Bet she's got some married boyfriend waiting to bail her out right now. The other officers chuckled, but his partner, Officer Willis, stayed quiet. He always did. Willis had been riding shotgun with Carter for 6 years, long enough to know when to keep his mouth shut. He glanced toward the cells, then back at Carter, his fingers drumming against the table. "She didn't seem like the usual ones," Willis muttered. Carter's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Willis shifted in his seat, uncomfortable under the weight of Carter's stare. "Nothing. Just, she didn't act scared." Carter's grin flickered, but he shrugged it off. "Some of them are better at hiding it. Doesn't matter." He leaned back, folding his hands behind his head. "She'll break like the rest." But deep down something gnawed at him. That cold, steady gaze. The way she hadn't flinched, even when the cuffs bit into her wrists. He pushed the thought away, drowning it in coffee and bravado. Hours passed. The rain outside slowed to a drizzle. Maya sat alone in the holding cell, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes remained fixed on the wall, watching, waiting. At midnight, the desk sergeant's phone buzzed. A lawyer, sleek and sharp, walked through the front doors. Papers were signed, money exchanged. Maya was free to go. Carter watched from the break room window as she stepped out into the night. She didn't glance back, didn't spit curses or threats like the others. She simply walked away, silent, composed. He told himself he had won. He told himself it was over. But something in his gut twisted as the door swung shut behind her. It was the same feeling he got when a gun jammed in the middle of a raid, like the next shot was still coming. And this time, he wouldn't see it until it was too late. Carter's morning started like any other, lukewarm coffee, paperwork, and the stale hum of the station's overhead lights. The precinct felt the same as it always did, filled with tired faces and the low murmur of voices trading stories from the night before. He leaned back in his chair, feet propped on the desk, replaying last night's arrest in his mind. Another black woman off the streets. Another name buried beneath a stack of false reports. The system worked best when nobody asked questions. His eyes flicked toward the hallway, where the captain's office door stood half open. Rumors had been swirling for weeks about a new commanding officer transferring in, some out-of-town big shot sent to clean up the department. Carter figured they'd last a few months, maybe a year, before the city chewed them up like all the others. "Morning briefing in 10, the desk sergeant called out, barely glancing up from his computer. Carter grunted, pushing himself to his feet. He straightened his uniform, making sure his badge was polished and his gun sat snug against his hip. His mind was already on the night ahead, another shift, another easy setup. The briefing room filled slowly, officers shuffling in with half-empty coffee cups and bloodshot eyes. Carter took his usual spot near the back, arms crossed over his chest. The captain's chair sat empty at the front of the room, but nobody seemed to notice. Then the door swung open. Maya Johnson walked in. Every head in the room snapped toward her. Carter's heart clenched in his chest, but he kept his face blank, masking the sudden chill that crept down his spine. She wore a crisp navy suit, her braids pulled back into a tight bun. The bruises from his cuffs were faint shadows on her wrists, barely visible beneath the sleeves. She walked to the podium with the same calm confidence she'd carried in the holding cell. Her dark eyes scanned the room, cool, calculating, before landing on Carter. He felt pinned beneath that gaze, like a bug caught beneath glass. The room fell into an uneasy silence. "Good morning." Her voice was steady, low, and authoritative. "I'm Captain Maya Johnson. As of today, I'm in charge of this precinct." Carter's breath caught in his throat. His mind scrambled to piece together what was happening, but the room had already shifted. Officers sat straighter. Whispers died. Even the desk sergeant looked up from his paperwork. Maya's gaze flicked back to Carter, her eyes locking onto his with surgical precision. Some of you may already know me. His stomach twisted. But for those who don't, she continued, her voice steady, I believe in accountability. I believe in integrity. And I believe that no one, no matter what badge they wear, is above the law. Her words sliced through the room like a scalpel. Carter's palms began to sweat beneath the table. She knew. She had known the whole time. Maya's eyes lingered on him for half a second longer, just enough to let him feel the weight of what was coming, before she moved on, outlining new department protocols and internal reviews. The other officers listened in stiff silence, glancing at each other like they were waiting for someone to break the tension. Carter's heart thudded in his chest, but he kept his face neutral. He had spent years surviving in this department, playing the game better than anyone. One night's mistake wouldn't be enough to bring him down. Or so he told himself. When the briefing ended, Maya stepped away from the podium. Officers filed out quickly, like they couldn't leave fast enough. Carter stayed frozen in his seat, his mind racing. He waited until the room was nearly empty before approaching her. Captain. He forced the word out, his voice steady. Maya turned slowly, folding her arms across her chest. Officer Carter. The way she said his name made his skin crawl. Welcome to the precinct, he muttered, forcing a tight smile. Didn't know we were getting new leadership. Maya's eyes never wavered. Funny, she said softly. I didn't know I'd be meeting old friends so soon. Carter's heart hammered beneath his uniform. He opened his mouth to speak, but she leaned in close, so close that only he could hear. I remember every face that's ever put cuffs on me, she whispered. Especially the ones who plant evidence. Carter's breath caught. I'll be watching you, she added, her voice low and lethal. Every shift, every arrest, every report. Then she stepped back, her expression smooth and unreadable. Dismissed, officer. Carter's jaw clenched as he turned on his heel, forcing himself to walk away with steady steps. But inside, panic twisted through him like a knife. He had spent years bending the system to his will, planting drugs, pocketing cash, silencing anyone who stood in his way. But now the system had turned against him, and Maya Johnson was holding the strings. By the time Carter reached his patrol car that night, the whole city felt heavier, like something was shifting beneath the surface, waiting to rise. He gripped the steering wheel tight, sweat slicking his palms. He had thought last night was just another setup. He never realized he was the one being played. Carter's knuckles whitened against the steering wheel as he rolled through the city's dimly lit streets. The weight of Maya's words clung to him like smoke, impossible to shake. The precinct felt like a trap now, every hallway lined with eyes, every report waiting to be combed through. He could feel her watching him, even when she wasn't there. His pulse quickened as he glanced at the rearview mirror for the third time in 5 minutes. The paranoia was setting in, creeping beneath his skin. For years, Carter had been untouchable. He knew the system better than anyone, how to twist it, how to bury his sins beneath stacks of paperwork. But Maya Johnson wasn't just another captain passing through. She was a ghost from a night he thought he'd buried. He flicked on the radio, static filling the car. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the speakers, but he barely heard it. His mind kept circling back to that night, the cold rain, the alley, the way she looked at him through the bars of the holding cell. He'd arrested too many people to remember them all. But he remembered her now. He'd planted the drugs without a second thought, same as always. Just another body to fill the system. He never imagined she would come back, much less wearing a captain's badge. The car's tires splashed through shallow puddles as he pulled into the shadowed lot behind a rundown diner. The place was a known meeting spot, off the books, cash only. Carter killed the engine and stepped out, the night pressing in close around him. Willis was already waiting at a corner table inside, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His partner's eyes flicked up, scanning the room before locking onto Carter. "You're late," Willis muttered, barely moving his lips. Carter slid into the booth, his back to the wall. "Shut up and listen." His voice was low, tight. Willis's eyes narrowed, but he leaned in. "She knows," Carter whispered. Willis's brow furrowed. "Knows what?" "Everything." Carter's gaze darted around the diner, scanning for anyone listening. "The setups. The drugs. Last night. All of it." Willis shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping against the edge of the table. "She's bluffing," he muttered, but there was doubt in his voice. Carter leaned in closer, his voice a razor-thin whisper. "She's not bluffing. She's setting me up, just like I set her up." Willis's eyes flicked toward the window, the neon sign casting flickering red light across his face. He looked like a man standing too close to the edge, one step away from falling. "What do you want me to do?" Carter's jaw clenched. "We bury her before she buries us." Willis's breath caught. For years, they had operated in the shadows, two ghosts slipping through the cracks. But this was different. Maya wasn't just another civilian. She had power now. "I'm not going down for this," Carter growled. Willis stared into his coffee, the silence stretching between them. Finally, he nodded. "I'll make some calls." Carter leaned back, his pulse steadying. The plan was already forming: smear campaigns, anonymous tips, whispers of corruption. He'd burned plenty of lives before. One more wouldn't make a difference. But as he walked back to his car, the night pressing heavy against his chest, a sliver of doubt wormed its way into his mind. Maya had played the long game, waiting years to rise through the ranks, climbing every rung of the ladder just to face him again. What if she wasn't just coming for him? What if she wanted him to fight back? By the time he pulled out of the lot, sweat clung to his collar. The city stretched out before him, silent and waiting. The hunt had begun. And for the first time in his life, Carter wasn't sure if he was the predator or the prey. The next day at the precinct, Maya was already there when he walked in. She stood in the hallway, clipboard in hand, issuing quiet orders to a group of officers. Her presence filled the space, calm and unshakable. Carter kept his head down, moving toward his desk. But as he passed her, she spoke without looking up. "Officer Carter." He froze, every muscle locking tight. "See me in my office." The words were smooth, almost polite, but they cut deeper than any threat. Carter forced himself to nod, swallowing the panic rising in his throat. He followed her down the hallway, every step echoing through the silence. Inside her office, the blinds were drawn, the air heavy with the scent of fresh coffee. Maya sat behind the desk, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "Close the door." Carter did as he was told, the latch clicking into place. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Maya leaned forward, her dark eyes boring into his. "I know what you've been doing," she said softly. Carter's heart slammed against his ribs, but he forced a smirk onto his face. "You got no proof." Maya's smile was slow, razor-sharp. "Not yet." Carter's breath caught. "But I will." He opened his mouth to speak, but she cut him off. "Every report, every body cam video, every complaint that was swept under the rug." She leaned back, her gaze never wavering. "I'm reopening everything." Carter's blood turned to ice. "You're making a mistake," he muttered. Maya's smile didn't falter. "No, Officer Carter." She stood slowly, circling the desk until she stood inches from him. "I'm correcting one." Carter's fists clenched at his sides. "Before I go on, I know you are enjoying the story, so I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, smash the subscribe button down below, and turn on the bell notification to get notified whenever I drop a new video. Alright, let's continue. He wanted to lash out, to threaten, to intimidate. But for the first time in years, he felt powerless. Maya leaned in close, her voice a breath against his ear. "You've been a ghost in this department for too long." She stepped back, smoothing the front of her blazer. But even ghosts can be hunted. Carter's heart pounded as he stumbled out of the office, the walls of the precinct suddenly feeling too close. He had built his empire on fear, on silence. But Maya Johnson wasn't afraid. And she wasn't staying silent. By nightfall, Carter knew what he had to do. If Maya wanted a war, he would give her one. He just had to make sure she didn't live long enough to win it. Carter sat in his dimly lit living room, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. The whiskey in his glass remained untouched, condensation pooling at the base. His mind spun with calculations, weighing risks against rewards. Maya Johnson was tightening the noose around his neck, but he wasn't about to let her pull it without a fight. He picked up his burner phone and dialed a familiar number. The line clicked, and Willis's gruff voice answered on the third ring. "It's done?" Carter asked, his voice low. "Not yet," Willis replied, his tone cautious. "But I've got someone looking into her personal life. Family, habits, anything we can use." Carter's jaw clenched. That wasn't fast enough. Every second Maya walked free was a second closer to his downfall. "Speed it up," he snapped. "I want leverage by morning." Willis exhaled slowly. "You sure about this, man? She's not like the others." Carter's grip tightened around the glass. "She's worse." He ended the call without another word, tossing the phone onto the couch. His mind raced through the options. Smearing her wouldn't be enough. Maya was too clean, too smart to have skeletons lying around. If he wanted to stop her, he had to break her. By sunrise, Carter was back at the precinct, coffee in hand and a calculated smile on his face. He made a show of chatting with officers, throwing in a few jokes to maintain the illusion that nothing was amiss. But beneath the surface, every glance he stole toward Maya's office sent a fresh surge of rage through him. By midday, Willis's message finally came through. Found something. Her brother, David Johnson. Junkie. Record sealed, but I know a guy. Carter's pulse quickened. Family secrets were the sharpest weapons. He fired back a simple reply. Dig deeper. He watched Maya from across the bullpen, her eyes scanning reports with calm precision. She had no idea what was coming. By nightfall, Carter met Willis behind a rundown warehouse on the edge of the city. The air was thick with the stench of mildew and gasoline. Willis leaned against the rusted doorframe, a cigarette dangling from his lips. David Johnson, he began, flicking the ash onto the ground. Arrested 3 times for possession. Did a 6-month stint in county back in '09. Carter's smirk returned. And she's been hiding it? Willis nodded, handing over a manila folder. Looks like she pulled some strings to keep it buried when she joined the academy. Family loyalty and all that. Carter flipped through the papers, his grin widening with every page. This is it. He closed the folder with a snap. We leak this to the right people, her whole career comes crashing down. Willis shifted uneasily. Carter, you sure you want to go this far? If she finds out... Carter's glare cut him off. She won't find out. The plan was simple. Leak the arrest records, hint at favoritism, and let the department's rumor mill do the rest. Once Maya's reputation was stained, no one would believe her accusations against him. By morning, whispers were already circulating. Officers huddled in corners, glancing at Maya when they thought she wasn't looking. Carter played his part perfectly, pretending to be just another cop hearing the gossip for the first time. But Maya never flinched. She walked through the precinct like a queen surveying her kingdom, head held high. If the rumors reached her ears, she gave no sign. By lunchtime, Carter was starting to sweat. Willis texted him. It's not working. She's not breaking. Carter's hands trembled as he typed his reply. Then we hit her harder. That night, he made the call. The same lowlifes who planted drugs for him in the past would plant something else now. Photos of David Johnson in a cracked den, doctored bank statements suggesting hush money. It would only take one anonymous tip to set the department ablaze. But as Carter hung up the phone, a knock echoed through his apartment. His heart skipped. Slowly, he approached the door, hand resting on his holstered gun. He opened it to find Maya standing on the threshold, her face calm but her eyes burning. Officer Carter, she said softly. Carter's pulse pounded in his ears. What are you doing here? Maya stepped forward, her presence filling the narrow hallway. I came to deliver a message. Carter's hand twitched toward his gun, but Maya's smile stopped him cold. You've been busy, she continued, her voice like silk over steel. Digging through my life. Planting stories. Carter's throat tightened. You can't prove anything. Maya leaned in, her breath warm against his cheek. I don't need to. She stepped back, leaving a single folded envelope on his table. See you at the precinct, officer. Carter slammed the door as soon as she was gone, ripping open the envelope with shaking fingers. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, black and white. It showed him outside the diner with Willis, exchanging the manila folder. Beneath the photo was a handwritten note. Ghosts can be hunted. Carter's breath caught in his throat. Maya wasn't just coming for him. She was already inside his head. The game was no longer about survival. It was about who would fall first. Carter's hands trembled as he held the photograph. His mind raced through every possibility. Who had taken it, how Maya had gotten it, what else she knew. The walls of his apartment suddenly felt too tight, the air too thick. He needed to think, to act, to get ahead of this before it spiraled out of control. He snatched his burner phone and dialed Willis. The line rang once, twice then. She knows, Carter hissed the moment Willis picked up. A pause. Then a slow exhale. What do you mean, she knows? Willis's voice was cautious, but Carter could hear the tension beneath it. I mean, she just showed up at my damn door, dropped a photo of us meeting at the diner. He ran a hand through his hair. She's playing us. Willis cursed under his breath. How the hell did she get that? I don't know, Carter admitted, pacing the room. But if she has one picture, she has more. She's not bluffing anymore, Willis. Silence stretched over the line before Willis spoke again, voice tight. We need to shut this down. Now. Carter stopped pacing, his jaw clenching. How? A pause. Then, we do what we do best. We make problems disappear. Carter's grip tightened on the phone. He knew exactly what Willis was suggesting. It was the only way to make sure Maya couldn't go any further. But something in his gut twisted. She wasn't just another obstacle. She was smart, too smart. "We can't be sloppy," Carter muttered. "If this goes wrong, we're done." Willis exhaled. "I'll handle it." Carter hesitated. For the first time in years, doubt crept into his mind. Maya wasn't just coming for him with paperwork and investigations. She was getting into his head, making him second-guess every move. And that made her more dangerous than anyone he had ever faced. But there was no turning back. By the time he arrived at the precinct the next morning, the atmosphere was different. The usual greetings from fellow officers were laced with hesitation. Conversations stopped when he walked past. Something was shifting. Maya was winning. He reached his desk, barely sitting before a voice interrupted him. "Carter." He looked up. Chief Reynolds stood in front of him, expression unreadable. The entire precinct seemed to hold its breath. "My office." "Now." Carter forced himself to nod, standing slowly. Every step toward the chief's office felt heavier. The moment he stepped inside, Reynolds shut the door behind him. "Have a seat." Carter lowered himself into the chair, his posture rigid. Reynolds took his time, settling behind his desk, studying Carter like he was already guilty. "We've got a problem," the chief finally said. Carter kept his expression neutral. "Sir?" Reynolds folded his hands. "Captain Johnson came to me this morning." Carter's stomach tightened. "She says you've been involved in illegal activities for years. Framing civilians, planting evidence. And she's provided compelling documentation." Carter's pulse pounded in his ears. "Sir, with all due respect, she's lying." Reynolds held up a folder and slid it across the desk. Carter hesitated before picking it up. The moment he flipped it open, his breath caught. Inside were pages of reports, body cam footage, transcripts, complaint records, suspicious case files, all linked to him. Some he had even forgotten about himself. But the last page was what made his blood run cold. A single sentence, typed neatly. "Officer Carter is now under internal investigation, effective immediately." Carter slammed the folder shut. "This is..." "Save it," Reynolds cut him off. "I'm not making a call until I have all the facts. But if even half of this is true, you're looking at more than just losing your badge." Carter forced himself to stay calm. "I need time to clear my name." Reynolds leaned back, his gaze sharp. "You have 1 week." "That's it." Carter stood slowly. "Understood." The moment he left the office, he made a beeline for Willis. "We need to move." "Now," he muttered under his breath. Willis frowned. "What happened?" Maya went to the chief. "We're under investigation." Willis swore. "So what's the plan?" Carter's mind raced. He had one shot at this. If Maya wanted to play dirty, he'd play filthier. "We set her up," Carter said, his voice cold. "Make her the villain." Willis hesitated. "How?" Carter's smirk was sharp and deadly. "We make her the corrupt one. Frame her for the same things she's accusing me of." Willis exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "That's risky." "It's our only option," Carter snapped. Willis nodded. "All right. I'll start working on it." Carter's fingers twitched. Maya thought she had him trapped. But she underestimated just how far he was willing to go. By the time he walked out of the precinct that evening, the plan was already in motion. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about destruction. Carter's breath fogged the windshield as he sat in his car outside Maya's apartment. The dim glow of the streetlights barely reached the cracked pavement. His fingers tapped against the steering wheel, the burner phone heavy in his pocket. Time was running out. He had planted enough evidence to paint Maya as a corrupt cop, but something gnawed at him, a sliver of doubt he couldn't shake. Maya was too meticulous, too calculated to leave herself exposed. Yet if the plan worked, her career would crumble before she even realized what had hit her. The plan was simple. A stash of marked bills hidden in her locker. A few anonymous tips sent to internal affairs. A forged ledger with Maya's name scrawled on suspicious payouts. He would leak the documents slowly, piece by piece, until suspicion consumed her. Carter flicked open the burner phone and texted Willis. "It's done. What's the ETA on the tip?" The reply came seconds later. "Already sent. IA will move tomorrow." Carter's lips curled into a smirk. Tomorrow, Maya Johnson would no longer be the fearless captain. She would be just another disgraced officer. But even as the satisfaction bloomed in his chest, a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He checked the time. 2:17 a.m. The night stretched on, heavy and silent. He finally started the engine, pulling away from the curb. The drive back to his apartment was slow, his mind replaying every detail of the setup. Every forged signature. Every doctored document. He convinced himself it was airtight. By the time he reached his apartment, exhaustion clawed at him. He locked the door, tossed the burner phone onto the table, and collapsed onto the couch. His eyelids drooped, but sleep refused to come. A soft knock jolted him upright. He froze. No one ever came to his apartment unannounced. Heart pounding, Carter crept toward the door, peering through the peephole. The hallway was empty. He waited, breath held, ears straining. Another knock, softer this time, like fingertips brushing against the wood. He slowly unlocked the door, opening it just a crack. A small envelope lay on the floor. No one in sight. Carter snatched it up and shut the door, flipping the envelope over in his hands. His name was scrawled across the front. No postage, no return address. He ripped it open. Inside was a single photograph. His own car parked outside Maya's apartment. The timestamp in the corner marked it less than an hour ago. Carter's pulse quickened. He scanned the photo, his mind racing. Someone was watching him, someone who knew exactly what he was planning. His phone buzzed. He snatched it off the table. Unknown number. He answered, voice low. Who is this? A pause. Then Maya's calm, measured voice filled the line. You're not as smart as you think, Carter. His heart slammed against his ribs. How did you? You think you're the only one who knows how to play dirty? Her voice remained steady, but there was an edge to it, cold and sharp. I've been 2 steps ahead of you since the day I walked into that precinct. Carter's mouth went dry. You have no proof. Maya chuckled softly. I don't need proof, Carter. I just need patience. The line went dead. Carter stood frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear. Sweat slicked his palms. He paced the apartment, mind racing. She was bluffing. She had to be. He pulled out the burner phone, dialing Willis again. She knows, he whispered. A long pause. What do you mean she knows? She's been watching us. Carter's voice cracked. I don't know how, but she's got something on me. Willis swore under his breath. What do we do? Carter clenched his jaw. We finish what we started. But even as the words left his mouth, the fear gnawed deeper. He wasn't the predator anymore. He was the prey. The next morning, Carter walked into the precinct, trying to ignore the weight pressing down on his chest. The whispers followed him, murmurs that stopped the moment he passed. Maya stood at the far end of the room, her arms folded across her chest, eyes locked on him. For the first time, Carter saw it, the confidence, the quiet power radiating from her. She knew, and she was waiting. By noon, internal affairs swept through the precinct. They combed through lockers, computers, files, everything. Carter kept his head down, pretending to be just as surprised as everyone else. But when they finally reached Maya's locker, they found nothing. Not a single marked bill. Not one shred of evidence. Instead, they found a flash drive hidden in Carter's own locker, filled with documents linking him to every dirty deal he'd ever made. Carter's blood turned to ice. He locked eyes with Maya across the room. Her smirk was barely visible. 2 steps ahead. Always. As the officers cuffed him and led him away, the last thing he saw was Maya's cold, unwavering stare. He had built his entire career on framing others. Now he was the one framed, and no one would believe he was innocent. The door closed behind him with a final, echoing thud. Carter's world shrank to the cold steel of the holding cell. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting pale streaks across the concrete floor. His mind raced, replaying every step, every forged document, every whispered deal, trying to pinpoint where the cracks began. He sat on the hard bench, hands clasped between his knees, sweat sticking to the back of his neck. The cell was silent, except for the distant murmur of voices from the precinct. Time crawled. His pulse thudded in his ears. Hours passed before the door creaked open. 2 internal affairs officers stepped inside, flanking a third figure. Maya. She wore her captain's badge like armor, her face composed, eyes sharp. Carter's stomach twisted at the sight of her. She stepped forward slowly, her heels tapping against the floor with a rhythm that echoed through the cell. Carter forced himself to meet her gaze, masking the fear clawing inside him. This is a setup, he spat, his voice low. You planted that flash drive. Maya's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile playing at the corners. You really think I needed to? She replied, her voice calm. You did all the work yourself. I just watched. Carter's jaw clenched. You have no proof. Maya's eyes darkened, the hint of amusement fading. You think I didn't notice you trailing me for weeks? You think I didn't know about the burner phones? The fake ledgers? She leaned in slightly, voice dropping to a cold whisper. I let you build the whole trap, Carter, so I could watch you fall into it. Carter's heart pounded. He glanced at the IA officers, stoic, unmoved. You can't pin this on me, he growled. You have nothing. Before I go on, I know you are enjoying the story, so I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, smash the subscribe button down below, and turn on the bell notification to get notified whenever I drop a new video. Alright, let's continue. Maya's smirk returned, slow and deliberate. Funny, she murmured. That's exactly what you thought about me. She slid a thin manila folder onto the bench beside him. Carter's fingers twitched, but he didn't reach for it. That's your life, Maya said. Every deal, every payoff, every dirty little secret. Carter's mouth went dry. I'm not going down alone. Maya's smile faded. You're not in a position to negotiate, Carter. She stepped back, her gaze steady. You tried to destroy me. Now you'll watch as I dismantle everything you built, piece by piece. The officers turned, motioning for Maya to leave. She lingered for a moment longer, eyes locked on Carter. You thought I was weak because I played by the rules, she said softly. But the difference between us is that I know how to break them without leaving fingerprints. The door closed behind her, the click of the lock sealing Carter's fate. He lunged for the folder, flipping it open with trembling hands. Page after page of evidence, bank transfers, surveillance photos, recorded conversations. It was airtight. His own game played against him. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Carter's confidence had crumbled into dust. He paced the length of the cell, mind racing for a way out. There was none. Outside, Maya sat in her office, the city skyline glowing through the window. The precinct buzzed around her, oblivious to the quiet war that had just ended. She opened a small envelope tucked inside her desk drawer. Inside was a single photograph, Carter sitting in his car outside her apartment the night before. She smiled faintly, then tucked the photo away. 2 steps ahead. Always. By morning, Carter's name would be splashed across every headline, another dirty cop exposed. Maya leaned back in her chair, the weight of justice settling on her shoulders. The game was over, and she had won. Carter's world had collapsed overnight. The headlines plastered across every news outlet painted him as the face of corruption, a disgraced officer brought down by his own greed. His face flickered on television screens, the anchor's voice cold and detached as they read out the long list of charges. Inside the holding cell, Carter sat slumped against the wall, his mind unraveling. The folder Maya had left behind still lay on the bench, its contents spilling onto the floor. Every piece of evidence was a nail driven deeper into his coffin. His breathing was shallow, heart pounding in his chest. The door clanged open, and 2 officers stepped inside. Without a word, they hauled Carter to his feet and led him down the narrow corridor. The walk felt longer than it should have, each step echoing in the sterile hallway. Carter's pulse quickened as they approached the interrogation room, a small, windowless space with a metal table and 2 chairs. They shoved him inside, locking the door behind him. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the walls. Carter's eyes darted around the room, searching for hidden cameras, any sign that he still had a chance to flip the game. But there was nothing. Minutes dragged into hours. The door remained shut. Sweat slicked his palms as he rehearsed lies in his head, trying to find cracks in the evidence. But the truth gnawed at him. Maya had played him perfectly. Finally, the door creaked open. Maya stepped inside, her badge glinting under the lights. She closed the door behind her and sat across from him, folding her hands on the table. Her expression was calm, unreadable. Carter forced a smirk onto his face, though it felt hollow. Come to gloat? Maya's dark eyes locked onto his, steady and unwavering. No, she said softly. I came to watch you break. Carter's smirk faltered. He leaned forward, the chains on his wrists clinking against the table. You think you've won, he snarled. You're just another puppet in the system. They'll chew you up and spit you out, just like me. Maya's gaze didn't waver. The difference is, she said, her voice measured, I built my career on cleaning up this department, not bleeding it dry. Carter's jaw clenched. He could feel the walls closing in, the weight of his own crimes pressing down on him. You're not untouchable, he hissed. Everyone's got dirt. Even you. A flicker of something passed through Maya's eyes, so quick Carter almost missed it. But then her expression hardened, and whatever vulnerability had surfaced vanished beneath her composed exterior. I'm not perfect, she admitted, but I never crossed the line. Carter's breath caught in his throat. The truth cut deeper than any accusation. He had spent years believing power came from corruption, that bending the rules was the only way to survive. But Maya had proved him wrong. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Maya leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "I could bury you with what I know." Carter's heart hammered in his chest. "But I won't." His eyes snapped to hers, confusion flickering in the depths. Maya's gaze was steady, but there was no mercy in her expression. "I want you to watch everything you built crumble," she continued. "I want you to feel what it's like to lose everything piece by piece." Carter's breathing quickened. "You're bluffing." Maya leaned back slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "Am I?" The weight of her words settled heavily between them. Carter's mind scrambled for a way out, but every door had been slammed shut. Maya stood, straightening her uniform. "This department will be better without you," she said quietly. Carter's throat tightened as she walked toward the door. "Wait!" The word escaped before he could stop it. Desperation clawed at the edges of his voice. Maya paused, hand on the door handle. "Please," Carter whispered. "We can cut a deal." Maya turned slowly, her eyes cold and sharp. "You don't get to bargain, Carter." She opened the door, letting the fluorescent light from the hallway spill into the room. "Your time's up." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Carter alone in the suffocating silence. He slumped forward, head in his hands, the chains around his wrists biting into his skin. The walls pressed in tighter, the weight of his own downfall crushing him. Maya's footsteps echoed down the hallway, steady and unbroken. Carter had always believed power came from corruption, from bending the rules until they broke. But Maya had shown him something far more dangerous. Power came from patience, and she had played him from the very beginning. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Carter's name was on every news station. The precinct would be purged, one dirty officer at a time. Maya sat in her office, watching the headlines scroll across the screen. One down, many more to go. She sipped her coffee, eyes steady. 2 steps ahead. Always. Carter's trial became the spectacle the city never saw coming. News cameras lined the courthouse steps, journalists scrambling to piece together the story of the fallen cop who had preyed on the very people he swore to protect. Every charge, fraud, evidence tampering, extortion, stacked against him like bricks in a wall closing in. Inside the courthouse, the air was heavy with tension. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations as reporters jotted down notes. Carter sat at the defendant's table, his once confident smirk wiped clean, replaced by a hollow stare. His orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame, the weight of his downfall showing in the lines etched into his face. Maya sat at the back of the courtroom, blending into the crowd. Her uniform was crisp, her badge gleaming under the dim lights. She watched every second unfold, her expression a mask of quiet control. The prosecution laid out the case piece by piece, bank transfers, surveillance footage, witness testimony. Every detail painted Carter as a predator who had fed off the system for years. The evidence was airtight, just as Maya had promised. Carter's lawyer tried to poke holes in the narrative, but every attempt crumbled under the weight of the facts. When the prosecution played a recorded conversation of Carter threatening a witness, his voice cold and calculated, the final thread snapped. A ripple moved through the courtroom. Carter's shoulders stiffened, his knuckles turning white against the table. He glanced over his shoulder, locking eyes with Maya. For a brief second, the hatred burned bright in his gaze. But beneath it, there was something else, fear. Maya held his stare without blinking. She could feel the power shifting, the very control he had once wielded now slipping through his fingers. By the third day, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts. The judge's gavel echoed through the room, sealing Carter's fate. He stood motionless as the sentence was read, 25 years without parole. The reporters outside scrambled to break the news, cameras flashing as Carter was led away in handcuffs. The city finally had its justice. Maya slipped out of the courtroom unnoticed, blending into the shadows. Her work wasn't finished. Carter had been the first, but far from the last. Back at the precinct, whispers filled the hallways. Officers who had once laughed behind Maya's back now avoided her gaze. They knew the tide was turning. In her office, Maya opened a locked drawer and pulled out a thin black notebook. She flipped it open to a fresh page, the names of corrupt officers scrawled in neat, precise handwriting. Carter's name had been crossed out in bold red ink. She tapped the pen against the next name on the list, her mind already working 2 steps ahead. A knock echoed at her door. Detective Ramirez stepped inside, his face tight. "Another tip came in," he said quietly. "Anonymous. Same handwriting as the last one." Maya's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good." She took the slip of paper from his hand, her eyes scanning the name scrawled across it. Another piece falling into place. Ramirez shifted on his feet. "You really think you can clean this place out?" Maya's gaze remained fixed on the paper. "One by one." Ramirez nodded, but there was doubt in his eyes. The rot ran deep, tangled in every corner of the department. But Maya had always known this was a long game. She closed the notebook, locking it back inside the drawer. "Start pulling the files," she said. "And make sure Carter's old crew knows. I'm watching." Ramirez nodded and left the office, the door clicking shut behind him. Maya leaned back in her chair, the city stretching out beyond the window. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the precinct. Carter's empire had crumbled. Now it was time to burn the rest. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "Nice work, Captain. But you're not done yet." Maya's heart quickened, but she kept her face composed. She typed a reply with steady fingers. "I never am." The game was far from over. But one thing was certain, she would always be 2 steps ahead. The sun dipped low over the city skyline, casting streaks of amber light across the precinct windows. The air inside the building was thick, charged with the kind of tension that lingered after a storm had passed, but before the next one rolled in. Maya sat at her desk, eyes locked on the black notebook in front of her. Carter's name remained crossed out in bold red ink, but the list was far from complete. Each name represented another fracture in the department's foundation, officers who had traded their oaths for power and greed. Her fingers traced the next name, Sergeant Travis Monroe. Monroe had been one of Carter's closest allies, operating under the radar while Carter absorbed the spotlight. He was careful, never leaving a trail, just whispers of threats and cash exchanged in back alleys. But no one was untouchable. A soft knock echoed against her office door. Detective Ramirez stepped in, holding a thin manila folder. His eyes flicked to the notebook before settling on Maya. "Surveillance came back," he said, placing the folder on her desk. "Monroe's been meeting with some heavy hitters downtown, businessmen with long rap sheets." Maya flipped open the folder, scanning the grainy photographs. Monroe stood in the shadows of a dimly lit bar, shaking hands with a man known for running illegal gambling rings. Another photo showed a cash envelope tucked beneath his jacket. Her heart hardened. "He's moving careful," Ramirez added. "Always uses burner phones, never the same meeting spot twice." Maya's eyes narrowed. Monroe thought he was invisible, just like Carter had. But patterns always emerged if you knew where to look. "Keep tailing him," she ordered. "I want every meeting logged, every face identified." Ramirez nodded, but hesitation lingered in his eyes. "There's one more thing." He shifted on his feet. "Internal affairs, they're asking questions. Word is some of the brass aren't happy about Carter going down. They think you're cleaning house for show, like you're trying to make a name for yourself." Maya's jaw clenched, but she kept her expression composed. "Let them think whatever they want." Her voice was steady. "I'm not here to make friends." Ramirez nodded, but the weight in his gaze lingered. "They'll come after you next, Captain. You know that, right?" Maya's lips curved into a faint smile. "Let them try." Ramirez left without another word, leaving Maya alone with the notebook. The shadows stretched longer across the office as the sun slipped behind the skyline. Her phone buzzed, another anonymous message. "Monroe. Dockyard. Tonight." Maya's pulse quickened, but she typed back without hesitation. "I'll be there." The game was already in motion. Night fell heavy over the dockyard. The scent of salt and rust clung to the air, mingling with the distant hum of cargo ships. Cranes loomed overhead like metal skeletons, casting jagged shadows across the cracked pavement. Maya crouched behind a stack of shipping containers, dressed in dark tactical gear. Ramirez was posted across the yard, his radio crackling faintly in her earpiece. "Eyes on Monroe," his voice murmured. "Black SUV, west entrance." Maya's heart beat steady as she watched the vehicle crawl into the lot. Monroe stepped out, his broad frame silhouetted against the headlights. He glanced around, paranoid but not paranoid enough. Another car pulled in moments later. The businessman from the surveillance photos emerged, flanked by 2 men built like hired muscle. Maya's fingers tightened around the grip of her gun. The men exchanged brief handshakes before Monroe opened the trunk of his SUV, revealing a duffel bag stuffed with cash. The businessman inspected the bag, nodding in satisfaction. "Drug money." Maya's blood ran cold. Got it all on tape, Ramirez whispered through the earpiece. What's the play? Maya's mind raced. She could take them down now, call in backup, make the arrests. But Monroe would only be another headline. Another dirty cop swept under the rug while the rot dug deeper. No. She needed to cut out the cancer at its root. We wait, she murmured. Let him lead us higher. Ramirez didn't question her. The deal wrapped quickly. Monroe closed the trunk, pocketing a thick envelope before climbing back into the SUV. The businessman and his men vanished into the night. Maya's eyes followed Monroe's car as it disappeared down the dockyard road. Tail him, she ordered. I want to know who he's working for. Ramirez's voice crackled back. Copy that. Maya stayed in the shadows long after the dockyard emptied. The city stretched out beyond the harbor lights, its secrets buried beneath layers of power and corruption. She knew the road ahead would be long. But she wasn't afraid. One by one, name by name, the list would be finished. And by the time she was done, the whole department would burn. The morning sun broke through the glass panes of Maya's office, casting long streaks across the floor. The city outside hummed with life, oblivious to the storm brewing within the department's walls. Maya sat behind her desk, the black notebook open in front of her. The red ink slashed across Carter's name felt like a small victory, but there was still so much left undone. Her phone buzzed against the wood. Another anonymous text lit up the screen. Monroe. Tonight. Abandoned warehouse. 11 p.m. Final drop. Maya's pulse quickened. This was it. The moment the whole operation could come crashing down. Monroe had always been careful, always 2 steps ahead. But tonight, he would walk straight into her trap. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The weight of what she was about to do pressed heavy on her chest. If she took Monroe down, the entire network of corruption would start to unravel. But if she failed, they would bury her along with the evidence. A knock sounded at the door. Ramirez stepped inside, his face tense. We got eyes on Monroe, he said, closing the door behind him. He's been making calls all morning. Sounds like he's tying up loose ends. Maya nodded slowly, her mind already piecing together the final play. Are the cameras set? Every angle. Ramirez's voice was steady, but there was something in his eyes, something cautious. Maya leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. This ends tonight. Ramirez shifted on his feet. And if it doesn't? Maya's gaze hardened. Then we burn with it. The warehouse stood at the edge of the city, hidden beneath layers of rust and neglect. Cracked windows loomed high above the lot, shattered glass glinting beneath the pale moonlight. The air reeked of oil and decay. Maya crouched behind a stack of rusted barrels, her pulse steady. Ramirez was stationed on the opposite side, watching the entrance. Hidden cameras blinked red in the shadows, capturing every second. Monroe's SUV rolled into the lot just before 11. He stepped out alone, his broad frame wrapped in a leather jacket. His eyes scanned the darkness, one hand resting on the pistol tucked beneath his coat. A second car pulled in moments later. The businessman from the dockyard deal emerged, flanked by the same muscle. Maya's breath caught. This was bigger than drugs. Bigger than cash drops in back alleys. This was the heart of the operation. Monroe opened the trunk, revealing another duffel bag stuffed with cash. The businessman nodded, but there was tension in the air, something different. Maya's radio crackled softly. Something's off, Ramirez whispered. They're nervous. Maya's fingers tightened around her gun. Hold position. The businessman leaned in close, murmuring something to Monroe. Monroe's eyes flicked toward the shadows, toward where Maya was hidden. Her heart thudded in her chest. Had they made her? The businessman stepped back, signaling to one of his men. The thug reached into his coat, pulling out a small black device. He pressed a button. A loud crack echoed through the night. Every camera in the warehouse went dark. Ramirez's voice crackled in her ear. They're jamming the signal. Maya's breath caught. Monroe's paranoia had paid off. No footage. No evidence. Her mind raced. She could wait, let the deal play out, and hope Monroe slipped up. Or she could end it here and now. She glanced toward Ramirez's position, catching his silhouette in the shadows. He gave a small nod. No turning back. Maya stepped out from behind the barrels, gun raised. Police! Hands where I can see them. Monroe spun, his hand flying to his weapon. The businessman's muscle reached for their guns. 2 shots rang out. Ramirez's sniper rifle cracked through the night, dropping one of the thugs before he could fire. The second man dug behind the car, returning fire blindly. Monroe ducked low, drawing his pistol. His eyes locked onto Maya, hatred flickering in his gaze. You don't know what you're doing, Captain. His voice was low, calm, like he still thought he could talk his way out. Maya's heart hammered, but she kept her gun steady. I know exactly what I'm doing. Monroe's lips curled into a sneer. You think taking me down will change anything? The whole department's dirty. I'm not here to clean the whole department, Maya shot back. I'm here for you. Monroe's finger twitched on the trigger. A single shot cracked through the night. Monroe staggered back, clutching his shoulder. His gun clattered to the ground. Ramirez stepped out from the shadows, rifle still smoking. The businessman made a run for it, but 2 patrol cars screeched into the lot, blocking his path. Officers poured out, weapons drawn. It was over. Monroe slumped against the car, blood seeping through his jacket. His eyes locked onto Maya, burning with fury. You think this makes you a hero? He spat. Maya holstered her gun, stepping close. No, she said softly. It makes me the last thing you'll ever fear. Monroe's gaze flickered, just for a second. Then the cuffs snapped around his wrists. By dawn, the warehouse was swarming with officers. Evidence bags lined the ground, cash, weapons, burner phones. The entire operation laid bare. Maya stood at the edge of the lot, watching Monroe loaded into the back of a squad car. The businessman followed soon after. Ramirez approached, exhaustion heavy in his eyes. We got them all. Maya nodded slowly, but the victory tasted hollow. This isn't over. Ramirez glanced toward the rising sun. It's a start. Maya's fingers brushed against the notebook tucked inside her jacket. Monroe's name would be crossed out by nightfall, but there were still so many names left. The city stretched out before her, broken and waiting. One by one, name by name. She would finish what she started, no matter how long it took.